Chapter 1. The lights dim, the corridor still. Only the clacking of a wooden stick accompanied by heavy footfalls from a pair of leather boots echoed rhythmically. The temple grounds were calm. In the hour of twilight on Coruscant, foot traffic in the temple hushed. While most residents returned to their creches and quarters, only the caretakers and appointed seneschals remained to ease the noise of the day to rest. It had not even been a full cycle after the diminutive Jedi had bestowed the rank of Master to another. Yet they had already sought his counsel.
I'm sorry to disturb you, Master.
The figure loomed.
Master Vernestra, bothering you something is.
Yoda replied as he continued to walk through the corridors, Qimir stick clacking on the floor for his usual nightly rounds.
I have yet to determine that, actually.
Vernestra brushed off her robes as they matched the Master's pace. Her breathing made apparent that she had rushed to meet Yoda at the first chance.
Choose another learner, I believe you will.
Correct. One has certainly caught my eye.
Vernestra responded rushed. Yoda stopped walking.
Much trouble I sense in you.
As you know, I've had many Padawans over the years. At the behest of the High Council, I am to take another.
She trembled in her speech increasingly.
But in this one, all I see is darkness.
Yoda picked up his stick and pressed it against Vernestra's lower thigh.
Careful, Master Vernestra. Mindful we must be of our own feelings. Much like an unyielding vine, fear grows. Pruned it must be, culled.
Vernestra took a moment to collect her thoughts.
I understand, Master. But we must also be mindful that in our efforts to prune the vine, it may yet choose another unwieldy path.
She sighed heavily before continuing.
Still, perhaps there's more to this initiate that I have yet to see.
Natural this is to feel. Dwell on this you must not. Wise are your words.
Yoda responded, returning to an earnest pace through the corridor.
Remember, if believe you do, that darkness surrounds him. Abandon him do not. Guide them you must. Hold the light that will show them the way.
She rushes to match his pace again.
I'm concerned it may not be so easy for Miral.
Much ambition I sense, Miral Kai. Difficult his path is, as is all of ours. But his path it must remain. Guide him you will.
Yoda raises his stick to Vernestra's waist and shakes his head. Yoda continues down the corridor, disappearing into the jet-black vignette of a slumbering hall. As Yoda faded from visual perception, she bowed, whispering to herself,
I shall reflect on your teachings, Master.
Vernestra had been a Jedi Knight, a Wayseeker even longer, and now a Master. She was always disciplined, followed the Jedi Code as closely as she could. She knew it was but a guiding passage for all Jedi to connect to the Force. But it was only natural that some would also quickly perceive it to be some code of conduct. The truth was, no one in the Order believed the code could be followed to the letter. She understood the difficulty of passing on knowledge, from one Padawan to the next. Each came with their own unique idiosyncrasies. It was in interpretation as well. You could say one thing with the intention of teaching something very specific, only to have your student interpret it in an entirely different way. Non-attachment was a particularly tenuous concept to teach to younglings. Children were brought to the temple at a young age before these attachments could form, but as they grew older and were taught to understand social concepts, they would naturally question the very nature of its stricture. Mentor to student, master to apprentice, attachments were a given. Many students reconciled with this by replacing the word attachment with possession, obsession. This very concept was one that Padawan Miral Kai had yet to fully grasp. The transition had been surprisingly smooth. When Vernestra had chosen him as her next Padawan, it hadn't been on his radar. He had been practicing forms with the other initiates when he had received the news. He always felt as though he blended in, that he didn't stand out. His daily routine was as normal as it could ever be. He hadn't been singled out by instructors, nor had he been particularly troublesome. He was an ordinary Jedi initiate. The following years had gone by with no incident. Vernestra had picked her moments to teach him, and he was confident in his applications of her teachings. These fleeting thoughts poured into his mind as he found himself on a mission with his master to free Togrutan slaves. Qimir caught the repulsor disc in midair, rotating his body into a flip to land gracefully. The child opposite from him was in awe. Qimir smiled back.
"That was a great throw, Aruni!"
Qimir shouted. The child jumped in excitement with his leku flopping joyfully.
"Hurry! Throw it back!"
This was all Qimir could do to pass the time. As they began their mission, her master would usually handle all the most difficult tasks. As her Padawan, he was responsible for tending to the refugees and making sure they had what they needed. But they were all survivors, hardened through adversity. They didn't need to be waited on. But Aruni was a different story. The only child in this batch of survivors. It was an ominous foreboding for the Togrutan people, but they would survive and recover from all of this. Aruni readied himself.
Don't go easy on me.
All right, here we go!
As Qimir prepared to throw the repulsor disc back, an explosion rocked the rear of the camp in which they were sequestered.
What's going on?
Aruni yelled. Qimir looked over at Aruni and waved his arms.
Aruni, run!
Aruni understood immediately and took off into the hands of his mother, who was watching him play happily from the wings. Vernestra rushed to Qmiril's side.
Padawan, it's time to move. The Zygerians have managed to quicken their pace. Get everyone ready to depart immediately. I will hold them off with a rear guard.
She darted off in the direction of the explosions as several Togrutan warriors joined her side. As part of an ongoing effort to dismantle remnants of the Zygerian slave empire, Qmir and his master Vernestra Rwoh were part of an independent contingent of Jedi tasked with extracting Togrutan slaves from the moon of Selrak. The empire had been upended throughout the centuries, but the Zygerians always found a way to operate on the outskirts of authority. Though the initial assault on the Zygerian citadel had not been particularly chaotic, this ambush had shaken Qmiril's foundation. He watched Togrutans fall one after another. An uncertain stillness pervaded amidst the audacity of the goings-on around him. However, sound and vibration returned to him as he refocused his mind and recalled his master's words. He shuffled back to the front of the camp where he began filing refugees into their cargo speeders. It was chaotic. The noise from the battle drowned out the noise of the horror. He did his best to shield the survivors from debris and fallout. As the last of the transports were ready to depart, he saw him, Aruni, alone and crouched in place, his mother at his feet, lifeless. Qmir looked back at the transport ready to depart and back at Aruni. His feet moved on their own as he bolted towards him. Using the force to propel himself, he slid to the child, catching him in embrace and covering his head.
"I've got you,"
Qmir whispered.
Mommy!
Aruni cried in Qmir's arms. Qmir placed Aruni on the ground and held him by his arms.
"We must go, Aruni. Your mother is with the Force now. You must be strong. Can you be strong for me?"
Aruni choked up and fought back even more tears.
Aruni can be strong. I will be strong.
All right, let's go.
Qmir took Aruni's hand. He wasn't prepared for what he saw next. As Qmir and Aruni made for the transport, his heart sank. He stopped in his tracks, his face filled with horror. Aruni stopped to look up at Qmir, confused. The last transport was gone, buried beneath a massive rock pile. He could only see what appeared to be someone's leg jut out from underneath. He fell to his knees and began to scream, his eyes welling up and his emotions overflowing. But there was no time for him to process. The shrapnel and debris from countless explosions rang Vernestra's ears. Her face was muddled with ash and microburns. As she climbed the mesa, the Zygerians rained down on the encampment with mounted rotary cannons. As she approached the main force, she ignited her light whip and began routing threat after threat. It was a graceful display of acrobatics and precision. A glowing purple stream raced through the ranks in an omnidirectional array of slashes, snaps, and flicks. Lashing her way through scores of Zygerians, she was a blur, her movements and agility marked by the sonic crackle that followed. The Togrutans, who had taken up arms to fight their oppressors, had marveled at her elegance and speed, but the only thing going through Vernestra's mind was far from beauty. It was visceral. Her face marred and scored by the aftermath of her deluge, it was but a brief glint in her mind, a swift wailing in the Force. She turned back to see the destruction, not in her wake, but the destruction wrought by the Zygerian weapons. Meryl was surrounded by blaster fire, holding on to a single child.
Meryl.
She whispered to herself amidst the pandemonium of the conflict. She gestured to the Togrutans who had flanked her. They boarded a Zygerian skiff recently abandoned and made their way back to the camp with haste. Vernestra had returned with surviving Togrutan warriors in a small skiff.
Meryl, get on.
She grabbed Meryl and Aruni and helped them on board. Vernestra signaled as the skiff darted off. They watched as Meryl's face was filled with shock. As the noise of the explosions died down, she looked around at the destruction. She sighed to herself and dropped to a seated position. As the skiff rocked back and forth, she swayed, catching her breath, but the look on Meryl's face would forever be etched onto her memory. His eyes wide, his breathing a rhythmic beat. By his side, Aruni arrested with fear, but also looking up at him, equally concerned. In the aftermath of the last extraction off Selrak, Meryl was never the same. Aruni had been entrusted with a family member who had survived, but unable to share a farewell. They never saw each other again. Meryl proceeded through the rest of the mission and returned to Coruscant as if droning through it all. Vernestra tried to reach Meryl several times on the way, but to no avail. The Force trembled in their wake. As Vernestra awaited their arrival to Coruscant, she fell into yet another hyperspace-induced trance. Something she had learned to control long ago. This time, it had found a way to intrude upon her mind forcibly. It was an emptiness that pulsed a shadowy enmity. There were no visions to be had with this trance. A void filled with a throbbing animus. The moment they landed on Coruscant and the ramp had lowered, Meryl had finally spoken for the first time. As Vernestra disembarked from the passenger ship, Meryl stopped her.
I think I finally understand what non-attachment means.
But before she could respond, Meryl had walked off, blank expression in tow. That encounter had shaken her. Having only just exited her hyperspace trance, she couldn't even find the words to respond. As her senior by centuries, Vernestra had always respected the wisdom of Yoda. Though his recent counsel had been less than enlightening, Yoda had espoused what he had always told others. But that was his way of letting his students and others arrive at the answers to their questions. It wasn't lost on Yoda that some situations required a bit more heft and personal touch. Perhaps it was a bit hasty to approach him only hours from her appointment to Master. She decided to let Meryl decompress on his own. They would approach him with the dawn of a new day.
I did the right thing.
Meryl had awoken from his sleep, breathing heavily. Just a glint of what had happened just days ago in his mind was all the reminder he needed of the terror of his choice.
I saw it coming.
As he sat up in his bed, his palms covered his face.
I had no choice. I didn't want to die.
Meryl's terrors were shaken loose as Vernestra had hailed his comlink. The sound of her voice screeched in through static.
Meryl, are you awake?
Yes, Master.
He rubbed his face and shook his head.
What is it?
Her voice crackled.
I was on my way to debrief the lower council. Did you want to accompany me?
Yes, of course.
Meryl responded robotically.
Meet me in the garden by the great tree.
He left his bed and proceeded to put on his temple regalia. As soon as the horrors had left his subconscious, the same vacant expression he had assumed upon landing returned to him. He was suppressing something deep inside. During their hyperspace jump from the Selrak system to Coruscant, he found solace in the Jedi Code, oddly enough. The words helped center him, In this very moment in his life, "there is no emotion" was the most profound wisdom he could ever cling to, though the words he had always heard speaking that line had never sounded so dreadful.
There is no emotion, no chaos, no victory. You will lose all that you hold dear until that emotion roils, until your anger and your hatred are sated. Those that are now lost do not revere your solace. They condemn your tranquility. They move to suffocate your equilibrium.
As Muriel arrived in the garden, he spotted Vernestra standing beneath the branches of the great tree, eyes closed. The Uneti tree stood towering over the garden for generations. The great tree witnessed the transition of the old Republic. It had lived through the wars with the Sith and the Mandalorians, the fall of Starlight Beacon, the passing and coming of Grandmasters. Throughout times of great chaos and imbalance, the Uneti remained steadfast.
Why do we always meet here, Master?
Muriel approached Vernestra still in a meditative stance. She opened her eyes slowly.
I thought you knew.
I've always wondered.
Muriel's thoughts drifted as he stared at the gnarled branches.
We Mirialans foster a strong bond with nature. This tree, for all its mysteries and boundless tales, has the perplexing ability to mute the turbulence of the Force.
She explained.
Turbulence?
Muriel questioned.
As Jedi, we have a strong connection to the Force. But that also means that the dark side is equally pervasive and ever watchful. The darkness finds no host in this tree.
He had met with his master under the great tree several times already since becoming her Padawan, and not once did he stop to consider how peaceful he had felt when standing in its presence. Even the blank look in his face had receded slightly. The Uneti tree was known for being Force-sensitive, but Muriel found it fascinating that it could somehow ease the darkness in the Force.
Now that you mention it,
Muriel found to caressing a budding leaf from the great tree.
I do feel oddly at peace.
Vernestra's brows knitted briefly.
Oddly. Come. We'll report to the lower council about our mission to Selrak.
Yes, Master.
Muriel snapped out of his gaze at the tree. As Vernestra and Muriel both entered the lower council chambers, the other council members were taking their seats. The atmosphere of the lower council always felt a bit more active and less solemn. While matters concerning the Order and the Republic entire was brought before the High Council, the lower council dealt with matters directly under the Jedi Order's purview, missions that were strictly under the Jedi's jurisdiction. This allowed for more streamlined logistics. Where the Jedi of the High Council were often preoccupied with maneuvering the politics of the Galactic Senate, the lower council could operate autonomously. Vernestra addressed the council members.
Members of the council, I'm here to debrief everyone on our mission to Selrak. We lost many in our endeavor to free the slaves in the sector under Zygerian control. But in those sacrifices, we've come this much closer to undermining the remnants of their slave empire.
The Quarren Jedi Master Nedek Modi stood up, raising his hand.
How many slaves were liberated from their oppressors?
According to the Anti-Slavery Committee, we have relocated and settled approximately 2,400 refugees.
She responded. To her surprise, the newest council member, Jedi Master Rovail Tundar, a human of middle age, found her voice.
Master Vernestra, to this date, how many slaves have we liberated through this ongoing endeavor to quash the surviving slave trade?
The human rubbed their chin, pondering.
So far, we have liberated 2 moons in the Selrak sector. As of today, around 6,000 slaves have been freed.
Vernestra reported from her prepared datapad. Master Rovail continued.
And to this date, how many casualties have you suffered?
Vernestra was taken aback. What was supposed to be a normal debriefing had suddenly turned into a hearing. She felt an underlying disdain in Nedek's voice. And Master Rwoh, although new to the lower council, had always had a very introverted disposition. The eyes of the lower council bore into her, prickly thorns finding purchase beneath her skin. Beyond the sudden shift of discourse, she did not expect this line of questioning, and it had raised her defenses.
I don't see how that is relevant, council member.
Oh, it very much is so. I'm starting to think the Zygerians will never truly be snuffed out. We've been fighting this fight since before even Grandmaster Yoda joined the Order.
Rwoh snapped back.
So, I say again, casualties?
Vernestra placed her hands on her datapad behind her and took a stalwart stance towards Master Rwoh.
We lost 32 Jedi Knights, and 232 civilian refugees.
And do you think this endeavor worth the losses?
She snapped back immediately.
We are trying to quell the remnants of the Zygerian slave empire, council member. There will be sacrifices, and those sacrifices will be honored by those who survived.
While Vernestra and Rwoh went back and forth about numbers, increasingly eschewing decorum, Qimir kept fidgeting, as if he held deeply onto something sealed within an airlock, fighting to be released. The voices were erratic, compulsory of an unnecessary frenzy. It was not just Rwoh and Nedek speaking with barbed voices. The lower council's hushed clamoring began to claw at him. Rwoh continued.
At this rate, we'll be fighting Zygerian insurgents and trafficking cells across the Outer Rim for the next century.
She sighed and reset herself.
Have you taken enough steps to minimize these casualties?
Nedek Modi interjected.
This will go over well with the Galactic Senate.
The voices in the gallery had increased in volume. More and more Jedi had risen to contribute to the cacophony of strife. Some were reverberating the same question. Others had taken to bombarding Vernestra with what could only be heard as gibberish amidst the racket of the chambers.
I assure you, masters, steps were taken to...
Vernestra was quickly interrupted again by Nedek Modi.
It is clear that this undertaking is above the capabilities of even the Jedi Order.
She was shocked at what was transpiring. There it was again. It had followed from her hyperspace trance. Their visit to the Great Tree had only silenced it briefly. A gust of darkness had taken the chambers, a miasma that threatened to destabilize the foundations of the Jedi Order. It felt as though a heavy blanket had been thrust upon the council chambers. Vernestra reflected on her time fighting the Drengir and the Nameless. The feeling was similar. It had all the telltale signs of the dark side, but this was different. That time, it was indiscriminate. It was primal. This invisible fog had intention, it had purpose, and above all, it had a target. The voices of dissent had all begun to harmonize in a furor that demanded Vernestra's submission. Qimir could do nothing but abide by the proceedings. He was only a Padawan after all. What could he offer to this very official and very proper conversation? He fidgeted with himself, eyes darting from one master to another as they rose up in protestation. The noise was increasingly weighing on him. Her master was respected by all measures within the Order, and yet the respect she commanded was almost non-existent. The words shouted from one end of the chamber to the other were edged. They began to slice through the thinning air, and Qimir caught every single glancing ricochet.
Council members!
Vernestra found the resolve to speak in volume, to snuff out Nedek and Rwoh's badgering.
There is a malice within these chambers that even now would wish us fight amongst ourselves.
Nedek and Rwoh looked at each other.
This is ridiculous.
Nedek responded. More voices from the gallery amplified the confrontation. It all began to trill in unison. Nedek had left his seat and was now standing in the aisle looking up to address the gallery.
To think that you would accuse these halls of malice is unbecoming, Master Vernestra.
Rwoh had also left her seat and was now addressing Vernestra within arm's length.
These chambers are sacred. Are you suggesting that we have all succumbed to the throes of darkness?
It is clear you are the one being tempted.
Nedek pointed at Vernestra.
Listen to yourselves.
She stepped forward in front of Master Rwoh.
I know we are encouraged to avoid the darkness, but that does not mean we turn a blind eye to its machinations.
So now we are delusional, is that it?
Nedek responded. The gallery hollered and clamored. Neither side had support. Even those in the adjacent mezzanine had begun to point fingers, and they weren't even directly linked to the proceedings. Muriel had now resorted to covering his ears with his hands. The noise was too much for him. A vortex of malcontent intruded onto his mind. He couldn't tell whether it was the noise of the chambers or something else entirely. His breathing rapid.
I resent these accusations,
Rwoh yelled.
Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
Vernestra asserted. Rwoh waved her hand to dismiss her.
That is enough, Master Rwoh.
This had never happened before, Vernestra thought. In her time in the Jedi Order, meetings of the Council had always fallen on decorum. Dignity reigned over pride, and yet on this very day, something had taken the atmosphere, siphoned it of all its renown. The vortex morphed into intelligible words. An amorphous voice spoke to Muriel as the shouting match continued within the chambers. He couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, but it didn't matter to him. All he could do was cover his eyes and ears and shield himself from the verbal brawl.
These are your masters. They see not your turmoil. They heed not your tumult. The Force is ever so one-sided. You must tip the scales into balance, into the dark side.
You are not qualified to be in these chambers.
Nedic finally shouted. Before Vernestra could fire back, Muriel snapped. His hands flailed. A wave emerged from his hands and pulsated outward, shoving Vernestra and Master Rwoh to the side.
Stop!
His voice echoed over hushed acoustics. Papers and journals whisked in the air. Master Rwoh had summoned a barrier around herself. Nedic had even unclipped his lightsaber from his belt by instinct. The tension in the room had reached its apex. Vernestra had been pushed to the ground, caught off guard. She turned to Muriel to see his hands outstretched, breathing intensely. She recoiled slightly and reached out.
Muriel.
Nedic scolded Vernestra.
Master Vernestra, stay your Padawan!
Vernestra raised her hand as if to shush the Quarren. Seeing this, Nedic guffawed and looked at his peers around him as if to summon support. There was none. All eyes peered at the single Padawan in the chambers, hunched over. She approached Muriel, his hands perched on his knees, panting heavily towards the floor, trying to brace himself. Muriel mustered up the courage to finally speak as his breathing reached a rhythmic crescendo.
It was all my fault.
What was your fault?
She replied. Muriel hesitated ever so slightly, but the time had passed for him to hold onto truth.
I saw the Zygerian's ion cannon fire. I knew it was coming. I made a choice.
She approached cautiously and with care.
Muriel, stop.
Master Rwoh chided Vernestra.
Enough, Master Vernestra.
She continued to press Muriel.
Go on, Padawan.
I ran from the rescue transport. I let those people die.
The council chambers collectively gasped, with sporadic murmuring traveling from one end of the chamber to the other. As Muriel fell to his knees, Vernestra dashed in to embrace him.
You saved a child. I saw you.
She consoled Muriel. Muriel had let loose a pained whine. Under stuttered breaths, he responded.
Because I ran. I chose to abandon the transport. I didn't want to die.
Tears began to well up in Muriel's eyes.
Rooney was the only one left.
Suddenly, the chamber door swung open. The light from the corridor had shone in as everyone's arms had instinctually gone up to shade themselves from the bright light. Clickety-clack. The eyes that had bored into Muriel had shifted. Clack-clack. It was though the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. Rwoh and Nedic both examined themselves as though waking from a horrible dream. Nedic saw his lightsaber in his hand and clipped it immediately, surveying the room and making sure no one had seen it. Click-clack. There he was, Master Yoda. The cloud that had been clawing at Muriel had subsided, but he was still racked with guilt, slumped on the ground crying. The small green Grandmaster had joined. He tapped his cane on the floor once more.
Finish your report, you will.
Yoda looked at Vernestra. As Vernestra struggled to speak through the recent revelation of her Padawan, the council chamber fell silent. Master Rwoh chose to return to her seat, stunned at the admission. Nedek Modi similarly sat back down in his chair. The deafening clamor of the gallery of voices still, as though someone had finally removed the blanket from their minds. But Vernestra would not dispel her barrier. She knew the darkness was coiled and ready to strike at any moment. As the meeting adjourned, those in attendance, including Nedek and Rwoh, had departed. Their irritable dispositions suddenly diminished entirely. Yoda, Vernestra, and Miral stood at the center of the chambers. She continued to console Miral as his cries echoed. What light remained in Miral had slowly begun to fade. Seated beside him, she looked up at Yoda.
What happened, Master?
Yoda sighed.
Difficult to say. Clouds everything the dark side does.
Even within these halls?
She responded.
Grow does the dark side, when fail the light does.
Do you sense something evil?
Evil? No. Fear I sense in your Padawan. Forever vigilant we must be. Named must his fear be, before it is to be banished.
Yoda closed his eyes.
We were at each other's throats just moments ago.
Our job it is to keep the path lit for those who follow. Do this we must, every day. Every second, like watching a campfire it is.
Vernestra had come to a startling realization that day. The nightfall surrounding the lower council chambers had not, as she thought, followed her from hyperspace. Its provenance was sinister, and it had found her pupil, clung to him. The darkness she had felt on the day she chose him as a Padawan had always been there. In the years since, that darkness had never gone away. It had only found reason to sleep. She would make it her absolute priority to expunge this intruder from her student. She would make safe Miral Kai. Then, 148 BBY. His store was dilapidated. All manner of sundries lay scattered in discord. It was clear he wasn't too keen on keeping things in order. May was told by her master that she would meet a contact on Olega for further details on the whereabouts of her quarry, Master Indara. But she did not expect someone as unkempt as this store to be them. She scanned and studied the front of the area, poring over every nook and cranny for small, minuscule details. She used every moment she could to employ what she had learned from her master, no matter how obscure. Appearing from just out of her periphery was a lanky young man, gaunt in appearance with messy locks draped across his face. He looked haggard, unkempt. This was who she was supposed to be contacting? Sure enough, this was the owner of the shop. This was her contact, Qimir.